This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to tonight's Storyworks Roundtable. We are super excited to welcome Chris Fox as part of our genre series. Chris is here to help us talk about science fiction. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure.
Hi, Chris.
All right. Chris has been writing since he was 6 years old and published his first story in The Rifter when he was only 24. That's really good, by the way. He lives in California with his wife, writes science and speculative fiction, as well as his super popular Write Faster, Write Smarter series. You can find Chris at chrisfoxwrites.com. Now, Chris has several great series out, including the Deathless series with 5 books, Project Solaris, which is a Deathless spin-off with 2 books, the Void Wraith trilogy and prequel, so there are 4 books, the Ganog Wars trilogy and prequel, which I think is your current work that you're putting out, and then the Write Faster, Write Smarter series with 6 books. So I think you're up to about 20 books, which...
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, is awesome. Now, all of your fiction books are science fiction, though Deathless is more of a genre-bending, head-splitting wow of a premise. You've got the military compound, werewolves, zombies, ancient aliens, Egyptian gods, and it's all set here on Earth in this post-apocalyptic world. Solaris begins on Earth but involves the hero getting involved in super secret high-tech alien conflicts. I noticed on your book page it says it's Heroes meets X-Files.
That's pretty accurate.
Yeah, very cool. And okay, Void Wraith and the Ganog Wars series, those 2 are hardcore outer space science fiction, correct? Did I get everything kind of?
You did. So for the latter 2 trilogies, it's kind of like Battlestar Galactica, the new reboot, or Mass Effect, the video game.
Cool, very cool. So why don't you tell us about your creative journey from the genre-bending series there at the beginning through to this kind of hardcore space opera type or space military type of science fiction?
Sure. So it was a very natural evolution for me because growing up, I've been into all types of speculative fiction. I love science fiction. I love fantasy. And I'm always writing one flavor of them. So everything from epic fantasy to urban fantasy to science fiction is fair game. The first series that I ever published started with No Such Thing as Werewolves. And my goal there was to take what is traditionally a fantasy trope, werewolves, and give a scientific explanation on how and why they could exist. So I did a lot of research on everything from, how DNA works, genetics, helioseismology, all sorts of different scientific disciplines in order for me to create kind of like a gray area, like my ancient civilization that comes to the fore in this series could really have existed. And I kind of leveraged a lot of the mysteries that haven't been solved to, kind of make that plausible. That was radically different than my approach to the military science fiction. I did a 21-day challenge where I wrote the novel with very little research up front. So the character development, I think, maybe leaves a little bit to be desired in that first trilogy, but the plot is very, very tightly paced. So it's a really fast read, and people seem to love that. The first series is for people who want to be thinking about it long after they stop reading the books and wondering. And the second is for people who want to kill a Saturday afternoon at the beach.
Right. Okay, now just to be clear, the first series is The Deathless, the one you're referring to here, and then the second is the Void Wraith trilogy. That was the 21-day challenge series. Is
right.
That's great. Okay. Very cool. And now you said there wasn't as much research going into that Void Wraith trilogy. So how did you handle the technology and, the science aspects of that compared to doing all that research for the Deathless series?
I'm really well steeped in science fiction, so if there's a sci-fi TV show or a popular book ranging from the 60s till today, I've probably read or watched it. So I just looked into the library of lore. I mean, everybody's got their version of faster than light travel and their various alien races. And I took some bits that I liked from, 20 or 30 different sources, and then I made up some of my own and shook them all up together. And that's what I came out with. So ultimately, I mean, there are some complaints from critics that the series is a little bit derivative.
Okay.
But despite that, people say it's recognizable and it's fun. So I think I succeeded on some level.
Definitely. I like that. Because on the one hand, it's a case of write what you know, because you're drawing on everything you love as a reader. And then, one person's derivative is another person's homage. So that's such a subjective claim. Very cool.
I think also I haven't read Deathless yet, the Deathless series yet, but having read the Void Wraith, it's very reminiscent of that sort of 50s style golden age of sci-fi in the Astounding type magazines where it was pulp fiction but translated into science fiction where you got an exciting story usually set in space, usually with some kind of science twist on it. But the idea was that it was, as you say, Chris, easily consumable and fun to read, not necessarily a grand dissection of, new science fiction breakthroughs or new science breakthroughs, even as related to science fiction. So I found it really eminently readable for that reason. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what? For you two, or all of you. Catherine, have you read much science fiction? I know you love the fantasy, but...
I have read some, not probably to the depth that I should for understanding the genre, but I do enjoy it on occasion.
We won't should people here, because... So, primarily Chris and Robert, but for everybody at the round table... What is the classic science fiction, the kind of pulp fiction in the 50s and 60s stuff? What is that comprised of, and how would you compare it to what is trending today? Give us kind of an overview if you can.
Robert, you want to take the first crack at that?
I'll give a simple sum up. Cowboys and Indians in space. They kind of took westerns and put them into a science fiction setting. I think that's probably the simplest summary of the good old magazine sci-fi stuff. But then some of the really good writers got in there, the Asimovs and Philip K. Dick, Heinlein, all those guys, and started to bring in some mind-bending ideas as well. So I think it was the combination of those two that, for me anyway, made it attractive. But yeah, I think it was just essentially a bit of genre bending. I suppose you have to think about where society was in those days. Technology was advancing extremely rapidly. There was already starting to be talk of orbits around the Earth, and we had potential moon landing plans leading up to JFK's famous statement. So I think it was a very exciting time to be exploring gadgetry, and I often remind myself, when I was reading some of this older stuff, they had these things that they could hold in their hand and press buttons, and it did stuff somewhere else. and, and now we have them in our pockets, and they're not just that; they do more than that. You can surf the internet and create whole computer programs with your phone. So anyway, that was a bit longer than one sentence, but I've often heard it described as a bit like Cowboys and Indians in space in terms of the pulp stuff. I don't know, Chris, do you have a different view of it? Do you take issue with that?
It's definitely similar. I don't have as good an analogy. That's perfect. Cowboys and Indians in space. I was going to say Flash Gordon, because that was my first introduction.
Right.
If you think about what makes Flash Gordon, you've got this kind of flashy hero doing things that don't make a lot of sense in space scientifically, shooting and guns and ships and the like. But we forgive it because it's fun. So it's simply new window dressing for what used to be Westerns. Because if you think about it, the West used to be the final frontier because we didn't realize we could go into space. And once the West was conquered and we had, kind of sort of carved up the world and everywhere was colonized and, we did maybe a little bit of Africa because that was still this dark continent, then we reached a point where there was nothing left on Earth. Science fiction is sort of the natural outgrowth. So if we want to have mythology, which, as Joseph Campbell would say, we need as part of human growth and development, it's always about some unexplored vista, and space really is the next one that we have. And I think that's why science fiction cries out to people so much.
Yeah, I love that. And I remember the TV shows, when I was a kid, they would have been in reruns, but like the Silver Lame suits and the space boots, and that one where the boy had the robot dog that just
Lost
sort
in
of
space.
creaked along.
Buck Rogers.
Yes. Yeah. So is today's science fiction still about a final frontier, or have we sort of surpassed that in our mind where, the frontier has already been breached? How would you compare today's science fiction to the foundation of science fiction.
Robert?
Wow, I was going to throw to you, I guess, first. I would say it's not particularly different for the mainstream. You've still got your highly speculative stuff on the fringes where, we might be considering some major advance in science that we're speculating now but has come true and has changed society and our social cultures, our social mores, maybe even, the way we reproduce. That I think it still existed back then, but I think the mass consumption is like any major genre, whether it romance or thriller or murder mystery, there's a central readership there that expects a particular thrill ride, and I don't think that's too different. Look at the reboots of Star Trek and the sequels of Star Wars. Yes. Same stuff, different day. So I don't know that an awful lot has changed there, and maybe that comes down to, as Chris says, it's still fundamentally the hero's journey. It's still fundamentally confronting something that's uncertain for us that we don't know, a frontier.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's changed startlingly little in the last 60 years, which really surprises me. So if you grab one of the best books from the 60s and you compare it to one of the best books from today, they're going to be about the same in that they're challenging boundaries based on whatever time the book was written in. But if you flip it around and you look at the pulp stuff that was coming out, the dime store novels versus the dime store novel equivalent today, 99 cents in the Kindle store, those stories are still scratching the same itch. They're still hitting the same notes that they were back then. It's really about familiar window dressing. So maybe I like fantasy over sci-fi, or I like sci-fi over westerns. That's my particular, constraints that I like to see for what I read. But ultimately, if you can give people good characters, they kind of want the familiar and they like having that same backdrop. That's why things like Western fantasy will never go away.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I remember reading a story by Ray Bradbury. It's called The Pedestrian, and it was set in, 58. I think it was 58. I think it was before the 60s. And it's about mind control through television, basically. So this man, the pedestrian, is out walking at night, and everyone else is at home glued to their TV screens. And this cop car comes, and over a loudspeaker he's basically arrested because the car doesn't have a driver. It's a driverless car. And of course today we've just hit that point of driverless cars being a thing that we're actually starting to deal with as a society. And I thought it was so interesting that Bradbury conceived of the driverless car and wrote it into the story, but in the background behind the voice he could hear the punch cards flipping in the computer. So, he never could have conceived of like the iPhone, all of these pocket-sized devices we carry around, and how sophisticated it was. So on the one hand, you've got the car, and on the other hand, you've got punch cards running it. What are some of the technological or science-based tropes that we need to be aware of as writers, or that are really fun to encounter as readers?
I guess I'll go first this time since we made Robert do the last two. I would say faster than light travel. You're going to need some sort of sensors that can be handheld, so think tricorder. You're going to have usually a military structure of some kind. Now, either that can manifest as something like Starfleet, where you have a military, or it can be like Firefly, where you've got just a captain of a ship and his ragtag crew. But in either case, you probably have 5 or 6 main characters that are interacting in this setting on a backdrop of a ship, and that ship allows them to change that backdrop kind of every episode or book, where they can go to different worlds and be embroiled in different adventures.
And maybe it's some kind of weapon tech as well. So, depending on what you settle in. Some people use a mix of everything. And again, I think we're descending into that whole sort of space opera military sci-fi, which is probably at the moment the mainstream of where most sci-fi readership is at. So outside of the, say, true speculative where, I don't know, people metamorphose into insects or something like that. There's you'd still consider that to be sci-fi, but it probably isn't the big selling trope. So in terms of, what reader expectations are in the big selling subgenres within science fiction, I think Chris is absolutely right there. Then you've got some other subgenres like time travel, for example, which has its own following. It's small, but it has a passionate following and people who just love to argue or confront the paradoxes. And I admire anybody who tries to write time travel.
Agreed.
Yeah. So what about, you touched on setting and technology. What about characterization? Because I noticed in your book Constellation, Robert, everyone was humanoid. I think the Rickamons were the sort of least human. Yep. And Chris, I was looking at the opening of your Ganok Wars book, and you're talking about like fur and teeth and two sets of nostrils and scales and stuff. So are there even like subgenres with kind of creature characters versus human characters? If someone's not a humanoid, are they automatically a monster? Kind of what do you think about developing characters for these genres?
I think that it really depends on your specific segment of readership. So the two biggest genres, as Robert said right now, are military science fiction, which is more the humanoids, and people want recognizable good versus bad. So they want to know what the bad aliens are and the good aliens. And then you've got space opera, where you can have good aliens, you can have a lot more nuance, you can spend some time developing what they look like, and readers will forgive that. But a lot of it comes down to the tolerance for new readers, and new readers don't like to see, I think, as much of that. So for my series in the Void Wraith trilogy, there's very little of that. It starts out with more of it's a human commander, it's a human ship. We're getting it from that point of view. And ultimately, while the Ganok Wars is its own series, it's a sequel series to that first one. So most people are coming into it already having seen a few of my races, and they're a little bit more tolerant of me having that kind of stuff in there.
Yeah, I would also say there's probably a cardinal rule that is, don't make your main character non-human.
Right.
If you want the books to sell and gain a larger readership, it has been done, and there's no reason why you can't do it. But just know that it's generally expected because we are who we are and we want to identify. It is much harder. Right. Now, that isn't to say you can't have a main character who is part cyborg or is enhanced, for example, because that's something we might aspire to, but none of us probably aspire to being an alien.
Right. That's a really interesting point, because we are, as human beings, hardwired to empathize, and the whole point of the point of view character is that we go on the journey through that character's perspective. So just as you were talking, Robert, I was kind of thinking of enhanced humans or whatever. And I think I've always seen them, not that I've read science fiction that widely, but I've always seen them as a supporting character, whereas the actual protagonist is fully human. We want the protagonist to be the David in the Goliath story, and to be able to step up and maybe save the enhanced person or whatever. And then with the other races, if you think to like Star Trek or something, they always look human, but maybe the skin's a different color, or Spock with the pointy ears or whatever. So they're still recognizable as one of us instead of other.
Yeah, it's that true space. I mean, I want to say it's a cardinal rule. Certainly if you're a new writer, you'd want to write that way. I mean, I've read some pretty good science fiction where point of view characters are aliens. I think, Chris, some of your point of view characters are alien characters as well, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. So I always have at least one in my books.
Yeah.
Fiskig in the new series, almost half the cast is aliens.
Yeah.
But are they the true protagonist or just point of view characters? Because you can have multiple point of view characters, but then the true protagonist could be one or a few.
The true protagonist is a male human captain.
Okay.
No, I wasn't brave enough to do the alien, but for the Reader Magnet, the short story that leads into the series, I did make the protagonist an alien, and I had a lot of fun with that, and there's been a surprising amount of enjoyment from fans.
Yeah.
I didn't know I was going to be able to pull that off because it's difficult to write from the perspective of an alien.
Right. Right. And how human-like is the alien? I'm just curious how much you felt you were able to play with that and push the boundaries of reader expectations.
I gave them 4 nostrils, and I have them open and close in certain different circumstances. They have a very nuanced sense of smell I got to describe. They could shapeshift into a much larger version of themselves. They could grow to be 10 meters tall. Their fur changed color with their emotions until they learned to control it.
Okay.
So I had little flourishes like that, but ultimately they kind of look like a gorilla. I gave readers a word they were familiar with to sort of, kind of form the basis of the alien. I mean, I didn't make it too different from a human.
Okay. Interesting.
They're good. They're great aliens. They're really good. I enjoyed them.
What about culturally, though? Like, is the alien culturally recognizable, like human-wise, culture-wise, alien-wise? Like, how alien did you make that culture in order for people to relate?
If you're a historian, you'll recognize exactly what pieces I took from which culture. So I started with 16th century Japanese, feudal society, and gave them a very similar culture. And then I dumped some Viking on top of it so that they were more crass and a little bit more boisterous, so that you couldn't tell they were going to be these refined samurai. And it worked really well.
Right. So there's touchstones
cool.
culturally that, we can relate to immediately, but then they're completely different.
Exactly.
Looking. Right.
Yeah, you just don't know why you relate to it necessarily, and so I think that's the deft touch that Chris is bringing in there. And when if you try to write something that's totally mind blowing, I think it's extraordinarily challenging to put it off and still keep the reader engaged to the character, because at some point you need to identify with something that's like us, and so if you're trying to write something that's completely alien, it's going to read as completely alien, and so therefore it might be hard work for the reader. Doesn't mean the reader won't enjoy it, but it will be harder work. And so maybe that separates those two perhaps big readerships, and there's crossover between them, but I like to read bizarre science fiction, but I am not necessarily going to read it when I'm really tired and I just want to escape for half an hour,
Right.
And so there's that sort of, mainstream tropes of, I suppose some of us sci-fi readers like to read that sort of trope because we're no different to romance readers in that respect. We just want to thrill for a couple of hours,
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of hard read, easy read distinction, I think, is interesting, Robert. It made me think of why I gravitate more toward science fiction in movies than in literature for relaxation, because so much is conveyed visually and auditorially through the movie, so I'm not trying to read hard words or made up words or long descriptions of technology or weaponry. You just see it, and so it's really easy to consume that way. So as writers, do you guys think about kind of where the line is there? Like, how much am I going to make my readers work to digest this scene? Do I need to pull back? Can I use more description? Where's clarity,
Absolutely. When I'm writing a scene, I definitely think about how much it's going to cost the reader emotionally to figure out everything that's happening. And then I limit things accordingly. It's part of why I use such recognizable tropes. People are using guns that they're going to recognize. They have armor that they're going to recognize. They use mostly speech patterns that are fairly recognizable. Because if all of that stuff kind of is baked into the story and is easy for the reader to accept, then the things you want to do that are really different, they're going to be much more likely to kind of gloss over or just accept whole cloth.
Yeah, that is such a great point.
I think also there is again, there's another subgenre of what we call, say, hard science fiction, where if you try to write it and you put really bad science in it, or you don't make it believable, then you'll just get legions of fans coming after you and saying, the way you explain faster than light actually isn't physically possible. And you get, well, hang on, faster than light still isn't physically possible according to our science, but so you get these incredible geek arguments. But I take the approach that Chris takes as well, and I think I think of two things. One is, as a reader, I want to be transported. And if it's sci-fi, I want to be transported into some realm that isn't available to me now. So whether that's, flying deep through, one of Chris's Helios Gate, Stargate type portals, or whether it's fighting some fancy alien that's, twice the size of me, but I'm wearing some tech mech that's going to help me. That transports me away from my problems at home type of thing. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is dripping in a few little bits of tech in there, and it can just sometimes just be a name. The way you name something can sound futuristic. And as Chris says, you can use specific terminology. So, daggers, swords, guns, those are, again, cowboy and western, type of things.
Right.
Or even borrowed from fantasy, but then you give them a fancy, plasma tech or whatever name, and all of a sudden, in the reader, in their mind, you haven't described it. You haven't said, that it had a double swirled helio barrel, nitrogen fueled whatever. You don't need to, because you let the reader decide what that's going to look like, because likelihood is, as Chris said, they've probably watched all those things that we've watched as well.
Yeah. It just a couple of weeks ago, I watched Avatar for the first time ever. I know it's like a 9-year-old movie or something, but I watched it and I thought, oh, this is a retelling of Dances with Wolves. It was totally the same story, just moved to space. And yeah, I was like, okay.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that before, but now you say it, I think, yeah, okay.
Yeah, you can't unsee it once you see it.
Yeah. So that cowboys and Indians in space, very true. So before we wrap it up, some tropes we haven't touched on yet, or maybe some examples from your own work of some of the things we've talked about, like a favorite character or a really challenging bit of tech you had to develop, or something you're just proud you got on a page.
Well, I think what I love the most about writing tropes is that you can make it as original as you want to. So I have this wonderful cat. Her name is Fizzgig. She is about to turn 17. She is loud and ornery, and she's deaf. So occasionally we may hear her today. She may come up to the door and start meowing. I decided to make her a character in the book, and I based an entire race off of her. I called her the Tigress. So the beauty of what you can do in science fiction is take something and mold it into the familiar. People have seen cat races done elsewhere. It's been done in a number of science fiction properties. And so it was really easy for me to create, my house cat in space and make it acceptable to the scientific community.
That's cool. I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Find links to Chris's website and show notes at storyworkspodcast.com, and look for the companion episode, because we're going to have Chris back on to talk more science fiction. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.